Hello, my name is Dr. Diana Tolmie from the Queensland Conservatorium, Griffith University. Welcome to the Music Livelihoods Knowledge Series 2023. This is a series of 6 sessions that invite people to join me on the journey of exploring musicians' lives. This knowledge series is also tied to the International Music Livelihoods Symposium, which is held online every year. So, last session saw us take a considered look at the musician's career journey and how certain mindsets and approaches can be identified. Musicians commonly work in portfolio careers, but they can adopt a protean or boundaryless approach to their work. That lucky break can be attributed to the chaos theory of careers, but when we drill down to how the event happened, there was more within our control than left to chance. To that end, the inevitable life and work opportunities within a musician's narrative more likely occur owing to our understanding of professional strengths, networks, opportunity recognition, planning, and how we react or respond to left-of-field events, where learning from experience is paramount to ongoing career development. We finish with discussing the hope-action theory, where hopefulness, self-reflection, self-clarity, visioning, goal-setting and planning, implementing, and adaptation were 7 identified competencies for career management. Above all, dreaming big is actually okay. However, musicians are at risk from burnout. This is largely owing to the say yes mindset that is prevalent in any referral-based careers, as predicting the future can be challenging, more so in current times. Further to this, although our passion and calling to the music vocation affords us some inoculation against the inevitable pitfalls of the profession, we need to be mindful of maintaining high priority on our mental health. So this session is about musicians' minds, our superior musician's brain, how our profession challenges it, and how we can look after it and therefore retain a healthy professional music identity. So let's first discuss the actual brain itself, how ours differs from the non-music brain, and how we have the potential to keep doing what we love long into retirement, whenever, if ever, that may be. So released in 2023 is a very good book titled The Musical Brain by Lois Svard, who justifies that neuroscientists are increasingly studying musicians and the process of making music to learn more about the structure and function of the human brain. There is no single area in the brain where music is processed. Instead, various elements of music are processed in areas throughout the brain and are connected by vast neural networks. Music has biological foundations, and we are hardwired for music just as we are for language. Further to this, there are recent studies suggesting that music was a form of communication long before language, and naturally this was something achieved in groups. Neuroresearcher and music educator Anita Collins supports this, suggesting that music, either listening or playing, is processed using older parts of the brain. You'll notice that babies sing before they speak, and for an alternate scenario, I had an elderly uncle who suffered a stroke once and would whistle his thoughts until his speech returned. The song Good Morning from the musical Singing in the Rain was a common greeting for him. So when using functional magnetic resonance imaging, or an fMRI machine, musicians' brains look very different to non-musician brains. For a start, they have much more grey matter in that they are denser with more neuronal cell bodies and unmyelinated axons. Studies have found that musicians have a larger corpus callosum, which is the bundle of nerve fibres that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain. This is even more prevalent in drummers. The nature of the drum kit requires a command of all 4 limbs, both individually and in a synchronized fashion. As Anita Collins would suggest, if you are saying your drummer is a little bit thick, you are right. So effectively, musicians have greater connectivity and communication between the 2 sides of their brain. They also have comparatively increased grey matter in certain areas of the brain, including the auditory cortex, motor cortex, and regions involved in spatial processing and memory. This suggests that musical training can lead to structural changes in the brain, particularly as the grey matter is largely fully developed by the mid-20s, when most intensive music training is completed. So the demands of learning and performing music benefit musicians in 8 key ways. The first is enhanced memory and cognitive function. The second is improved executive function. The third, increased focus and attention. The fourth is enhanced motor skills. The fifth is that we have boosted creativity, which can stimulate the brain's creative centers, leading to improved creativity and problem-solving skills. More on this soon. Music minimizes loneliness. So the sheer nature of music is that it's performed in groups and often with rehearsals and concerts, and there is socialization beforehand. You might have the cup of tea and the breaks and the drinks after the events. So that mingling with each other is really valuable, also with the audience members. So it's this highly socialized activity which staves off depression and loneliness, which is one of the big ones to look out for when we get older. Engaging with music, so musicians basically end up releasing the feel-good natural drugs. Dopamine is released in general, appreciation of music, and more so as instrumentalists of a job well done. This in turn releases adrenaline, which is fundamental for motivation, thus driving us to continue the task. Overall, playing music is a great way to minimize depression and to stay excited about life. These feel-good happy drugs, particularly endorphins, are further useful in overcoming setbacks. So when we've had a knock, get back to doing what you love best. And it's literally a way to heal. And finally, music improves hearing, but not in the way you think. So everyone's hearing goes south once we hit 60. And we also know that musicians need to work in dangerously noisy environments. However, a paper published in Brain and Cognition Journal looked at the research that has found that musicians have better speech in noise perception. What is this? This is something that when you're in a noisy conversation environment, older people find it very hard to discern individual voices. So they find it isolating and thus retreat from social events. This study asked if short-term music training might be beneficial for older adults, even if they didn't have music training in their background. And the answer was a resounding yes. So overall, musicians are likely to develop age-related brain pathologies such as reduced cognitive function, anxiety and depression, and dementia, as what we do, if we keep doing it, keeps us happy, active, interested, curious, challenged, and social. Yippee! But the question is, what can harm our brains? Well, the big ones are stress, anxiety, and depression. So they can negatively impact a healthy brain, literally creating holes. And for musicians, this occurs from professional setbacks, working odd hours, overwork, a challenging work environment, be that the people or the conditions, sudden change of lifestyle and work environments is experienced in touring, and just the sheer nature of being a creative artist. For some, a large chunk of what they have to do as a musician is isolating. The sheer physical demands of practice are often as intense as the mental investment. There exists a lot of frequent critical feedback, either from colleagues or from the broader public, thanks to social media. And there's an inherent awareness of the artistic gatekeepers and therefore higher precarity for those who choose more high-risk employment. So this all sounds a bit gloom and doom. So what to do? So look, through my work with musicians and educating early career musicians, I get to hear the story lives of roughly about over 400 musicians every year. And one of the questions asked is, discuss the highs and lows of your career and how do you deal with disappointment? And so now I'm going to discuss the most common responses. In doing so, I hope some of this resonates with you and allows you new perspectives on how to manage your own careers and protect that beautiful brain of yours. So the first most common answer: you have to experience the lows of the music profession to appreciate the highs. Essentially, this quote is accepting the continuum of life and humanity. What it further indicates is that one needs to possess a level of resilience, a large theme for this session. So what is resilience? That's a question that you can ask yourself. Is it contextualizing both successes and failures, particularly because our art is personal? Is it the ability to be inspired by and interpret rejection through reasoning? Is it adaptability? Is it developing a thicker skin to protect oneself from criticism of our personal work? Is it the ability to cope and succeed where others have failed, going beyond those immediate problems and barriers? Or are people just born with a resilience capability? So we turn to some statistics of mine. What you're seeing here is the response to the question, in general, I consider myself to be a resilient person. I've also placed their comparative passion and calling indicators we worked through in session 1. So the dates are 2018 to 2022, and these are first year undergraduate conservatoire students. And then we have the 2017 dates are Australian portfolio musicians from my doctoral study. Now, if we hone in on the resilience figures for the moment, what you're looking at is the weighted average out of 5, where closer to 5 means strongly agree. And the percentages are the percentage of the cohort that answered either agree or strongly agree. So in other words, the positive. Question to ask is, what do you notice, if at all, about the resilience figures? So the answer to that is the 2017 musicians are the strongest. They had an average age of about mid-40s, and there was a 60-40 split of male to female and an average 20 to 25 years of professional experience, thus meaning they were well conditioned to the highs and lows and had figured out strategies to maintain their resilience and thus an ongoing career. During the 2020 pandemic year, the students were the highest because they experienced the biggest perceived setback to their career thus far, and their resilience was tested, but it comparatively dropped by 10% the following year, which indicates something's up. 2021 cohort also experienced all of the initial stress of the pandemic, albeit as those finishing high school. Why were their scores lower? So this is where we start talking about whether the thing that poses the need to be resilient is chronic, meaning to persist for a long time, or is recurring, or acute. So the following information is taken from an excellent article titled "How People Learn to Become Resilient" by journalist Maria Konnikova. Norman Garmese, one of the first US researchers into child resilience, suggested that what matters is the intensity and the duration of the stressor. In the case of acute stresses, the intensity is usually high. The stress resulting from chronic adversity, Garmese wrote, might be lower, but it exerts repeated and cumulative impact on resources and adaptation and persists for many months and typically considerably longer. In the case of the pandemic, we combine acute and chronic. We have quite a nasty cocktail that challenges our resilience and therefore passion, as my statistics show. So Garmese's work opened the door to the study of protective factors, the elements of an individual's background or personality that could enable success despite the challenges they faced. Unfortunately, he suffered from Alzheimer's and couldn't finish his work. This was further taken on by students who identified elements that fell into two groups: individual, psychological factors, and external, environmental factors, otherwise known as disposition on one hand and luck on the other. Now, another developmental psychologist named Emmy Werner completed a 32-year longitudinal study on 698 children from birth to mid-30s in Hawaii. What a study. So 1/3 of these children qualified as at risk, but 33% of those children ended up attaining academic, domestic, and social success. And they were always ready to capitalize on new opportunities that arose. So she found several elements predicted resilience. Luck. A resilient child might have had a strong bond with a supportive caregiver, parent, teacher, or other mentor-like figure. But most of the elements were classed as psychological and had to do with how the children responded to the environment. From a young age, resilient children tended to meet the world on their own terms. They were autonomous and independent, would seek out new experiences, and had a positive social orientation. She said, though not especially gifted, these children used whatever skills they had effectively. Perhaps most importantly, the resilient children had what psychologists called an internal locus of control. They believed that they, and not their circumstances, affected their achievements. The resilient children saw themselves as the orchestrators of their own fates. So further explaining my own data and affirming the intensity and duration theory of stresses, Werner also discovered that resilience could change over time. Some resilient children were especially unlucky. They experienced multiple strong stresses at vulnerable points and their resilience evaporated. Resilience, she explained, is like a constant calculation. Which side of the equation weighs more, resilience or the stresses? The stresses can become so intense that resilience is overwhelmed. So most people, in short, have a breaking point. On the flip side, some people who weren't resilient resilient when they were little somehow learned the skills of resilience. They were able to overcome adversity later in life and went on to flourish as much as those who'd been resilient the whole way through. This, of course, raises the question of how resilience might be learned, and this leads us to common musician answer number 2. I guess there have been some bad experiences, but I choose to take away some good learnings for the future. And if anything, those bad experiences strengthen my resolve to keep on going with my career. And so here we talk about growth. So George Bonanno is a clinical psychologist at Columbia University's Teacher College. He heads the Loss, Trauma and Emotion Lab and has been studying resilience for nearly 30 years. He coined a term PTE, or potentially traumatic event. The theory is straightforward. Every frightening event, no matter how negative it might seem from the sidelines, has the potential to be traumatic or not to the person experiencing it. In other words, frame adversity as a challenge and you become more flexible and able to deal with it, move on, learn from it, and grow. Focus on it, frame it as a threat, and a potentially traumatic event becomes an enduring problem. You become more inflexible and more likely to be negatively affected. This further justifies common answer number 3. The negative event turned out to be a good thing, as it forced me to reconsider my values and capabilities and move into a different and more preferred direction. In this case, we call this adapting to thrive. And what I find really interesting about this common response is the reassessment of values, which we know need to align with our actions, as well as strengths or capabilities, which need to be effectively utilised to achieve what we value. That ability to reflect as a form of career development and management was one of the Hope Action Theory competencies. So another very common response to the highs and lows question was answer number 4. The down times really make you question your identity as a musician and your relationship with your music. And this is where we enter the concept of possible selves. So to explain, possible selves consist of 3 parts: what one hopes to be, hoped for selves, what one expects to be, expected selves, and what one fears to be, feared self. For some, it's a sliding scale. Some people consider all 3 at once. All are motivating, be it for better or worse, and guide our career journey, be it consciously or subconsciously. So in short, the low events experienced can affirm our feared selves, the highlights can affirm our hoped for selves, and so we gain a conflicting mix of emotions depending on our definition or perception of success, fear, and love. That is, love for what we either do or want to do, and fear that we will not attain it or it will be taken away. So a reflective question for you, and perhaps something you can discuss in a group, is what are your perceptions of success? What I find fascinating is that extreme highs and extreme lows can equally threaten one's musical identity, and we label this identity threat. This is the result of events that deeply challenge how one sees oneself. COVID was an excellent example of this. As we know, many musicians were thrust into the depressing land of online live music experiences, or at worst, having to seriously question whether they could call themselves a musician within an environment that was making it impossible to be one. Many musicians were exposed to the reality of their feared possible future selves and found it very challenging to reconcile. Those that were able to navigate the pandemic successfully had what Breakwell and Jaspel call identity resilience. Through a good look at all of the studies completed on musicians during the first 18 months of the pandemic, and then a good look at some case studies, they suggested that this type of resilience is largely based on one's level of self-efficacy, one's ability to understand and overcome challenges, their self-esteem, the ability to retain a sense of self-worth and value, their consistency, the ability to safeguard a consistent sense of self, and their positive distinctiveness, which is the perception of a unique sense of self, that is an autonomous understanding of one's career pathway, which further indicates an internal locus control that I am a master of my own fate. So from their research, they have hypothesized that musicians who have higher baseline levels of identity resilience will exhibit less negative effect, so such as fears and worries about the future. They may therefore be less susceptible to identity change when exposed to the stresses associated with the pandemic or future mega disruptions. So another discussion point you might have for yourself or with your colleagues, how do you deal with disappointment? I have a lovely performance psychologist friend of mine who wrote in one of her papers, the most successful of performing artists are not immune from disappointment. They have just learned how to more effectively manage their response, and this is called resilience. And we often consider the speed at which one can achieve this. And this is where we get into strategies to manage one's response to the setbacks or the stresses of our music careers and protect our beautiful brain from damage. So Dr. Lucy Hone is the director of the New Zealand Institute of Wellbeing and Resilience, and she's delivered fabulous TED Talks on resilience and also written a wonderful book titled Resilient Grieving. Her 3 secrets of resilient people is worth repeating as they offer opportunities to develop personal strategies. So number 1 is that resilient people know that suffering is part of human existence. In other words, the good, bad, and ugly is part of life and speaks to the earlier topic that the lows are there to appreciate the highs. Thus, the strategy is to reframe why me to why not me. Number 2, resilient people are really good at choosing very carefully where they select their attention. That is, they focus on what they can change and accept what they can't. For example, you've had a bad gig. Do you need to learn some more skills to achieve a better result next time? That's fine. Or was the circumstance beyond your control? That's fine too. And the third and final one speaks to avoid rumination of the event and or refusing to grow around the experience. So resilient people ask themselves, is what I am doing in whatever response to that trauma or obstacle helping or harming me? So some other strategies that scholars have identified to aid resilience and build resilience is have supportive role models. It helps to develop a positive, resilient professional identity. And then it enriches your support networks or your professional networks, which you can draw from. People in your tribe, from your industry, your university, your teachers, your family, and your peers. Number 3 is networking and meeting new people combats isolation and encourages collaboration. Keep in contact with those you met in university as well as other areas of the profession. You'll be surprised at the similarity of experiences and how much help and support is available to you. Another concept is embracing rather than resisting failure. So learning, otherwise known as failing forward or learning through failure, and is a big part of this is reflecting on one's actions and asking questions. What happened? What would you do the same or differently if given a chance? Then reframing the discussion is the basis of cognitive behavior therapy. Reframing one's attitude changes one's behavior and hence the result outcome. Another building resilience strategy is deliberate and conscious, which is stepping out of one's comfort zone and accepting and adapting to all and any outcomes. And finally, conducting your own creative projects is another way of saying just do your own stuff. This is where you get to fill up your cup, have an internal locus of control and autonomy, and you're just effectively not beholden to artistic gatekeepers. It's quite empowering. So a less common, but no less powerful response to the highs and lows question is, I've never had any lows. And this leads us to the concept of future-proofing. So future-proofing, which we'll investigate more deeply next session. Essentially, resilience is usually about reacting to an event, recovering, adapting, and coping. Whereas if we use scenario planning, foresight, and preparation to minimize obstacles, our music identity is more likely to have the capacity to be fluid and not as susceptible to identity threat, which is another form of insulation against the stress of perceived precarity. There are some other considerations that can make one's resilience and career development challenging. The status of one's mental health. Some musicians who live in a very creative space, we have singer-songwriters, composers, jazz musicians, for the tip of the iceberg example, have been known to suffer from bipolar and or deep depression. Studies have determined that the creative mind is more at risk of mental health pathologies than those in other occupations. And it's worth mentioning here that while there is still much more research to be done in the area, the fact that creative people tend to get blue does not imply that being blue, you tend to get creative. I remember I had one colleague who did suffer from bipolar, would deliberately put herself into a depressive state, thinking it would bring on further creativity. and unfortunately all it did was make her unable to function. Thus, mood disorder doesn't help creativity at all, but creativity creates a mood disorder as a byproduct. Why is this? Well, it goes back to the fact that creatives and musicians have better wiring. Remember the earlier discussion of denser brains, more grey matter? Well, there's also been studies that have affirmed that musicians can have low levels of noradrenaline, and that's the same as saying norepinephrine, which means the brain has a broad network of communicating neurons, which is great for lateral and out-of-the-box thinking, something needed for creativity, where the brain is required to be in a state of low-intensity activity. But it has been shown to play a role in a person's mood and ability to concentrate. So low levels of norepinephrine may lead to conditions such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, depression, and hypertension, which is very low blood pressure. So far we have talked about the musician's brain and its strengths, the musician's response to stress in the form of resilience, which can potentially protect the brain, and some physiological conditions our creative brains find themselves in. On to more of psychological related experience of musicians, and the big one and the source of grief for many is perfectionism. So our questions are, what is perfectionism? What are the benefits of perfectionism? And what are the detrimental effects of perfectionism? So there are three domains of perfectionism. We have self-oriented perfectionism, and that is having unrealistic expectations and standards for oneself that lead to perfectionistic motivation, often found in those who experience obsessive passion. The second one is socially prescribed perfectionism, and that's developing perfectionistic motivations due to the fact that significant others expect them to be perfect. This is found in high-pressure environments, for example, high-profile classical orchestras, mainstream popular music, and don't forget those engineers working in live sound. And the most concerning is called other-oriented perfectionism, having unrealistic expectations and standards for others that in turn pressure them to have perfectionistic motivations of their own. I'm sure we've sadly met or worked with that person, and they are like cancer. So something to consider. Rather than a perfectionistic mindset, what would be a preferable perspective to adopt? So another way of achieving a focus on excellence is to aim to adopt a flow state. So that's the happy medium of focus and satisfaction from the balance between one's capabilities and challenges in one's performance of work. So without a mind shift to excellence, a focus on the process, rather than perfection, a focus on the outcome, a perfectionistic approach can lead to what we call unhelpful thinking styles that some of you may be familiar with or witnessed others experience this. And this image is from a fantastic resource called psychologytools.com. Well, what else can we recommend to our perfectionists? Well, the first one is just be kind to yourself. Monitor your self-talk, reframe the context. So often our goals, be they performance or otherwise, can be blown out of proportion. Notice the positive in constructive criticism and accept it. Perhaps place the words not in the negative self-labels and basically flip all of those unhealthy thinking styles that you see on their head. It's easily said than done. Owing to the nature of neuroplasticity, the process of restructuring the brain, this takes time and persistence. So to further protect that wonderful big musician's brain of yours, I look to the work of Dr. Dan Siegel, who coined the Healthy Mind Platter. And these are 7 daily essential mental activities to optimize brain matter, create well-being, and minimize or avoid burnout. First one is focus time. When we closely focus on tasks in a goal-oriented way, we take on challenges that make deep connections in the brain. And so our music activity is well placed for this. So a big tick for us. Then we have playtime. When we allow ourselves to be spontaneous or creative, playfully enjoying novel experiences, we help make new connections in the brain. So doing something different with your music, or even better, attain a new hobby. Then we have connecting time. And when we connect with people, ideally in person, and when we take the time to appreciate our connection to the natural world around us, we activate and reinforce the brain's relational circuitry. This is where we can engage the mirror neurons. So it's really important to retain and develop our empathy. Physical time is when we move our bodies aerobically if medically possible. We strengthen the brain in many ways, but it's important for blood flow and brain oxygenation. Time in, when we quietly reflect internally, focus on sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts, we help to better integrate the brain. So in other words, practice mindfulness. Downtime is when we are non-focused without any specific goal and let our mind wander or simply relax. We help the brain recharge. And in sleep time, when we give the brain the rest it needs, we consolidate learning and recover from the experiences of the day. Consider your sleep hygiene, limit screens before going to bed, stick to a routine where possible, and get your 7+ hours. One thing you didn't mention, but no less important, drink water and limit alcohol to avoid dehydration. So drinking water has been shown to improve cognitive performance, particularly in tasks requiring attention and working memory. Remember, the brain is about 73% water. Eating healthily is likewise a given. And that concludes today's session. The next session will discuss the topic of musician strategies for career sustainability. In session 2, we looked at how music careers progress from early through to late career musicians. For this session, we look at musicians' different approaches to sustaining their passion, be it navigating their artistic values, developing a portfolio career, engaging with non-arts employment to support their music, or championing entrepreneurial arts leadership and job creation. So in particular, this session will discuss a very recent study on the transferable skills of musicians with dual careers in non-music workplaces and how they balance both careers.